I never imagined a mailbox could become the reason someone tried to destroy my wife's peace of mind. But looking back now, I realized the mailbox was never the real issue. It was about power, ego, and one woman who had spent so many years controlling our neighborhood that she'd forgotten what it sounded like when someone finally told her no. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm a software developer outside Columbus, Ohio, and my wife Claire and I had been living in Maple Ridge Estates for a little over 3 years. We weren't the loud neighbors. We weren't the people throwing parties every weekend. And we certainly weren't looking for a fight with the homeowners association. Most evenings followed the same comfortable rhythm. I'd get home around 6. Claire would already have dinner going while telling me about another day reviewing financial reports for the regional accounting firm where she'd worked for more than a decade. We'd eat on the back patio, wave at a few neighbors walking their dogs, and joke that suburban life was probably as exciting as watching paint dry. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened the front door and immediately knew something was wrong. Claire was sitting at the kitchen table with her phone in both hands, like she was afraid it might ring again. Her face had gone pale, and she'd barely looked up when I asked what happened. She quietly turned the screen toward me. 12 missed calls, all from the same number. Then she pressed play on one of the voicemails. The voice belonged to Lorraine Caldwell, the HOA vice president, a woman somewhere in her early 60s who dressed like every board meeting was a political campaign and walked through the neighborhood as if she personally owned every blade of grass. Her message started politely enough before turning icy. "Mrs. Brooks, you've ignored multiple attempts to comply with association standards. If this continues, consequences will follow." The next voicemail was worse. Then another. By the 6th message, she wasn't even pretending to sound professional anymore. She talked about fines, liens, damaged credit, legal action, and somehow managed to mention our mailbox in nearly every sentence. Claire looked at me and whispered, "I haven't even talked to her." That was the part that bothered me most. Claire avoided conflict almost to a fault. If someone accidentally overcharged us $5 at a restaurant, she probably apologized before asking for the receipt. The idea that she'd intentionally provoke someone like Lorraine didn't make sense. I walked outside to see what this mailbox emergency actually looked like. It was a mailbox, dark charcoal instead of the faded beige the neighborhood preferred because Claire had repainted it over the weekend after years of sun damage. It honestly looked better than most of the mailboxes on our street. Sitting inside it were 2 certified letters. The first demanded $700 for violating architectural standards. The second charged another $450 for failing to attend an emergency compliance hearing that neither of us had ever been notified about. Payment due in 5 business days. Failure to comply could result in additional legal action. I actually laughed for a second because it felt so absurd. Then I noticed Claire standing behind the screen door trying not to cry, and suddenly none of it was funny anymore. I called the number on the letter before I could think twice. Lorraine answered after one ring, almost like she'd been waiting beside the phone. "Mr. Brooks," she said, sounding strangely pleased. "I was wondering when you'd finally call. I asked one simple question. Can you tell me which section of the HOA rules says our mailbox violates community standards?" There was a pause. Then she chuckled. "Those documents aren't something residents need to interpret on their own." I frowned. "I'm a resident. Then your wife should have shown more respect when I contacted her." I glanced toward Claire, who looked completely confused because she'd never actually spoken to Lorraine once. "She never ignored you," I replied. "She didn't answer because she was working." Lorraine's voice sharpened instantly. "Excuses don't matter. Around here, compliance comes first. Either she learns that, or life gets very expensive." I could actually hear the smile in her voice. It wasn't about rules. It wasn't even about the mailbox. She wanted us scared enough to stop asking questions before we'd even started asking them. When I asked again to see the written regulation, she simply said, "Attendance at Friday's hearing is mandatory. Bring your checkbook." Then she hung up. That night, Claire locked herself in the bathroom, and for nearly 20 minutes all I could hear was quiet crying through the door. I sat on the hallway floor wondering how a woman we'd never had a real conversation with had managed to make my wife feel unsafe inside her own home. Then, somewhere around 2 in the morning, while Claire sat silently staring at the dining room table covered with those ridiculous violation letters, something clicked in my head. I stopped thinking about who Lorraine was and started remembering exactly who my wife was. Claire wasn't just an accountant. She was a forensic CPA who had spent 12 years following paper trails that other people desperately wanted hidden. I looked at her and said 4 words that changed everything. Let's follow the money. Claire looked at me for a long second, wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweatshirt, and gave the smallest nod I'd ever seen, the kind that says someone is still hurting but has finally found a direction. She disappeared into the home office while I made coffee neither of us was going to finish. By 2:30 in the morning, every monitor in the room was glowing. One screen displayed the county's public records portal. Another was filled with HOA financial statements stretching back years. And a third, slowly filled with spreadsheets. Claire built herself as she compared every payment, invoice, vendor, and budget revision. I wasn't much help beyond bringing coffee and reading document names aloud. But after 12 years of marriage, I'd learned something about watching Claire work. She never chased the obvious mistake. She waited for numbers to tell their own story. Around 4 in the morning, she leaned back, narrowed her eyes, and whispered, "That's strange." I walked over. "What?" She pointed at a landscaping invoice that looked perfectly ordinary. "Nothing's wrong with this payment by itself." Then she opened another month, and another, and another. The same vendor kept appearing, except the amounts never followed a pattern. Some months were $3,000, others $9,000, then $12,000, then $2,000. No contract amendments, no board explanations, just money moving. "That's how people hide theft," she said quietly. "Never steal the same amount twice." She searched the vendor registration. Nothing. She searched state business records. 5 minutes later, she found a limited liability company called Summit Community Solutions. Its registered mailing address wasn't an office. It was a small commercial building on the edge of town with only 3 suites. Then, she opened another document. Her eyebrows lifted just enough for me to know we'd crossed into dangerous territory. "Ethan," she said without looking away from the screen. "Guess who's listed as the registered agent?" I didn't answer because somehow I already knew. Lorraine Caldwell. We sat there in complete silence. The company receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars from the HOA was controlled by the same woman threatening homeowners over mailbox paint. Claire didn't celebrate. She didn't even smile. She just kept digging because she refused to accuse anyone without evidence that could survive a courtroom. Hour after hour, she traced payments through annual budgets, reserve fund reports, maintenance contracts, and insurance reimbursements. Some invoices described playground repairs that never happened. Others charged for storm cleanup during months when there hadn't even been significant rain. One invoice billed for replacing entrance lighting, except those lights had been installed before we moved into the neighborhood and had never changed. Every document alone looked harmless. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Just after sunrise, Claire finally exhaled. $348,000. I stared at the spreadsheet. "Missing?" She nodded. "Not technically missing. Redirected." She highlighted nearly 60 transactions flowing into Summit Community Solutions over 6 years. The money belonged to the homeowners. It had simply been disguised as maintenance expenses. I suddenly understood why Lorraine had been so desperate to intimidate us over something as ridiculous as a mailbox. People who abuse power eventually start testing how much fear they can create with the smallest excuse. If everyone obeys over a mailbox, nobody questions the bank account. Claire printed everything, every invoice, every transfer, every public filing. Then she organized it into a binder thicker than my hand using color tabs like she was preparing for a federal audit. Around 8:30, she made the first phone call. It wasn't to the sheriff. It wasn't to the HOA. It was to the Financial Crimes Division at the state attorney's office. She calmly explained that she believed a homeowners association officer had diverted association funds through a related business without disclosure. Whoever answered must have recognized the seriousness immediately, because within minutes an investigator requested every document electronically. Claire uploaded everything before hanging up. Then she made one more call. This one was personal. Her father, Daniel Mercer, had spent nearly 20 years serving as county commissioner before announcing his retirement earlier that spring. He'd always refused to interfere in our lives, and honestly, we almost never asked him for help. But this wasn't asking for favors. It was making sure the right people knew where to look. I only heard Claire's side of the conversation. "Dad, no, we're okay. Yes, emotionally we're fine. I need you to listen carefully." She explained everything in less than 5 minutes. When she hung up, she looked strangely calm. "He's making 2 phone calls," she said. "One to confirm the investigators received everything, and another because he thinks this shouldn't disappear quietly." By lunchtime, local reporters had already submitted public records requests asking about a newly opened investigation into possible financial misconduct involving Maple Ridge Estates. Somebody inside the county courthouse clearly understood that sunlight was the best disinfectant. Meanwhile, Lorraine had absolutely no idea. In fact, around 1 that afternoon, another certified letter arrived. This one increased our fines because we had allegedly shown hostile behavior toward board leadership. I actually laughed out loud. Claire looked at me and shook her head. She's still playing checkers. Friday evening arrived. The same evening, Lorraine demanded we appear before the compliance hearing. The clubhouse parking lot was packed. Homeowners walked inside carrying checkbooks because everyone assumed another round of fines was coming. Lorraine stood near the entrance dressed in a navy blazer with a silver HOA badge clipped to the lapel like she represented some kind of government agency. She spotted us immediately and smiled the way predators smile when they think escape isn't possible. "I'm glad you finally decided to cooperate," she said loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear. "It's never too late to learn how this community works." Claire simply smiled back. "You're right," she answered. "People are about to learn exactly how it works." Lorraine frowned but brushed it off, assuming it was empty confidence. We took our seats near the back while the board members shuffled papers and whispered among themselves. The meeting began with routine business before Lorraine proudly announced our violation case. She described us as disruptive homeowners unwilling to follow community standards, then recommended additional penalties because of our so-called disrespect toward board authority. She looked directly at Claire. "Do you have anything you'd like to say before the board votes?" Every eye in the room turned toward us. Claire stood slowly, carrying nothing except a slim folder. Her voice never rose above a normal conversation. "Actually, yes." She placed several printed documents on the board table. "Before discussing mailbox colors, I thought everyone here deserved an explanation for why nearly $350,000 in homeowner funds appears to have been paid to a company controlled by this board's vice president." The room went completely silent. Lorraine stared at the papers without touching them. One board member reached forward, flipped through 2 pages, then looked at Lorraine with genuine confusion. "What is this?" Claire answered before Lorraine could. "Public records, bank transfers, vendor registrations, tax filings. Every page has already been delivered to state investigators this morning." Lorraine's face lost every bit of color. She forced out an awkward laugh. "These accusations are ridiculous." Claire didn't argue. She simply slid one final document across the table. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why Summit Community Solutions lists your personal signature as its registered agent." Nobody said a word. You could literally hear the air conditioning humming above us. Lorraine finally grabbed the microphone. "This meeting is adjourned." She stood so quickly her chair tipped backward onto the floor. Several homeowners began shouting questions all at once. Others demanded copies of the documents. One elderly man stood up and yelled, "I've been paying special assessments for 10 years. Where's my money?" Lorraine pushed through the crowd without answering anyone. She practically ran to the parking lot while board members remained frozen inside the clubhouse staring at one another, as if they'd just discovered the foundation beneath them had disappeared. Claire squeezed my hand under the table. Neither of us said a single word because we both knew the hardest part was no longer proving the truth. It was waiting to see how much of it would finally come crashing into the open. The weekend felt strangely quiet, almost like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Saturday morning, people who had barely waved to each other for years were standing in driveways comparing copies of financial reports someone had already emailed around the community. Every few hours, another rumor spread. Someone claimed Lorraine had hired a lawyer. Someone else insisted the investigation was already over. Then another neighbor said state investigators had been seen carrying boxes out of the HOA office. We ignored the gossip because facts had finally replaced speculation. And facts move at their own pace. 4 days later, just before sunrise on Wednesday, I woke up to flashing blue lights reflecting across our bedroom ceiling. Claire was already looking out the window before I even reached the curtains. Sheriff's deputies had parked in front of Lorraine's house while 2 investigators carried thick document cases toward her front door. Across the street, a local news van pulled up just as another camera crew arrived. The timing wasn't an accident. Public corruption attracts attention because people understand instinctively that it's never just about money. It's about trust. Lorraine opened the door still wearing a bathrobe, looking more annoyed than worried, until one deputy handed her the warrant. Even from our yard, I could hear her repeating, "This is a misunderstanding. I'm the vice president. I run this community," the deputy answered calmly. Ma'am, today we're here because of the investigation, not your position. Those words seemed to drain every ounce of confidence from her face. Neighbors slowly gathered along the sidewalks. Nobody cheering, nobody clapping. Just watching in stunned silence as the woman who had spent years threatening everyone with rules and penalties was escorted to a patrol vehicle in handcuffs. The television cameras captured everything, but what stayed with me wasn't the arrest itself. It was the expressions on people's faces. Relief, disbelief, anger over the years they'd spent writing checks without asking questions. By that afternoon, investigators confirmed they were examining allegations of financial fraud, self-dealing, tax violations, and breach of fiduciary duty involving HOA funds. The story spread far beyond our neighborhood, and suddenly reporters wanted interviews with homeowners who had experienced suspicious fines or intimidation. We declined every request. Claire said something I'll never forget. This shouldn't become about us. It should become about fixing what allowed it to happen. She was right. Within a week, the remaining board members called an emergency community meeting, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Nobody sat quietly waiting to be lectured anymore. Homeowners came carrying folders, highlighted documents, and pages full of questions. The board's attorney stood first and spoke with none of the arrogance we'd seen before. Every outstanding fine issued under Lorraine's authority was immediately withdrawn. The association formally apologized for improper enforcement practices. A motion to permanently remove Lorraine from every board position passed almost unanimously. Then came the proposal everyone had really been waiting for. An independent accounting firm would conduct a complete forensic audit. Monthly financial statements would be published online for every homeowner to review. Vendor contracts would require competitive bidding, and no board member could ever approve payments involving personal financial interests again. When the attorney asked whether Claire would consider reviewing the transparency policy before implementation, she politely smiled and said, "I'd rather stay a homeowner than become part of the board." The room actually laughed, breaking weeks of tension in a way that felt almost healing. Our own settlement was surprisingly simple. Every dollar we had been fined was refunded. The association agreed in writing that no future board could retaliate against us for participating in the investigation. They also reimbursed legal expenses we had never even expected to recover. But if I'm being honest, the money never mattered much to us. The best moment came several weeks later on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Claire was outside repainting our mailbox, the same mailbox that had somehow started this entire chain of events. This time, she chose a deep forest green because she liked the color. A neighbor walked by, smiled, and jokingly asked, "Think anyone's gonna complain?" Claire laughed, dipped the brush back into the paint, and answered, "I think they'll probably read the rule book first." We both laughed harder than the joke deserved because we knew what it really meant. Fear had finally been replaced by accountability. Looking back now, I don't think Lorraine ever cared about our mailbox. It was simply the smallest excuse she could find to remind everyone who she believed was in control. Unfortunately for her, intimidation works best when nobody looks behind the curtain. The moment someone follows the paperwork instead of the threats, power built on secrecy begins falling apart faster than anyone expects. Every neighborhood has rules, and honestly, good HOAs can protect property values and keep communities running smoothly. But the second leadership starts believing they're above the very people they're supposed to serve, something has already gone terribly wrong. So here's what I'd really like to know. If you had discovered what we discovered, would you have quietly paid the fines to keep the peace? Or would you have risked everything to expose the truth? Let me know in the comments because I genuinely want to hear where you draw the line between keeping harmony in a neighborhood and standing up for what's right. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes accountability should never depend on how powerful a person thinks they are.